Chapter 49 of the Eustace Diamonds. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Mill Nicholson. The Eustace Diamonds by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 49. Bunfit and Gager. As soon as the words were out of Mrs. Carbuncle's mouth, those ill-natured words, in which she expressed her assent to Mr. Bunfit's proposition that a search should be made after the diamonds among all the possessions of Lady Eustace which were now lodged in her own house, poor Lizzie's courage deserted her entirely. She had been very courageous, for though her powers of endurance had sometimes nearly deserted her, though her heart had often failed her, still she had gone on, and had endured and been silent. To endure and to be silent in her position did require great courage. She was all alone in her misery, and could see no way out of it. The diamonds were heavy as a load of lead within her bosom. And yet she had persevered. Now as she heard Mrs. Carbuncle's words, her courage failed her. There came some obstruction in her throat, so that she could not speak. She felt as though her heart were breaking. She put out both her hands, and could not draw them back again. She knew that she was betraying herself by her weakness. She could just hear the man explaining that the search was merely a thing of ceremony, just to satisfy everybody that there was no mistake, and then she fainted. So far Barrington Erle was correct in the information given by him to Lady Glencora. She pressed one hand against her heart, gasped for breath, and then fell back upon the sofa. Perhaps she could have done nothing better. Had the fainting been counterfeit, the measure would have shown ability. But the fainting was altogether true. Mrs. Carbuncle first, and then Mr. Bunfit, hurried from their seats to help her. To neither of them did it occur for a moment that the fit was false. "The whole thing has been too much for her," said Mrs. Carbuncle, severely, ringing the bell at the same time for further aid. "No doubt, mum, no doubt. We has to see a deal of this sort of thing. Just a little air, if you please, mum, and as much water as 'ud go to christen a babby. That's always best, mum." "If you'll have the kindness to stand on one side," said Mrs. Carbuncle, as she stretched Lizzie on the sofa. "Certainly, mum," said Bunfit, standing erect by the wall, but not showing the slightest disposition to leave the room. "You had better go," said Mrs. Carbuncle, loudly and very severely. "I'll just stay and see her come to, mum. I won't do her a morsel of harm, mum. Sometimes they faints at the very first sight of such as we, but we has to bear it. A little more air, if you could, mum, and just dash the water on in drops like. They feels a drop more than they would a bucketful, and then when they comes to, they hasn't to change theirselves." Bunfit's advice, founded on much experience, was good, and Lizzie gradually came to herself and opened her eyes. She immediately clutched at her breast, feeling for her key. She found it unmoved, but before her finger had recognized the touch, her quick mind had told her how wrong the movement had been. It had been lost upon Mrs. Carbuncle, but not on Mr. Bunfit. He did not at once think that she had the diamonds in her desk, but he felt almost sure that there was something in her possession, probably some document, which, if found, would place him on the track of the diamonds. But he could not compel a search. "Your ladyship'll soon be better," said Bunfit, graciously. Lizzie endeavoured to smile as she expressed her assent to this proposition. "As I was saying to the elder lady." "Saying to who, sir?" exclaimed Mrs. Carbuncle, rising up in wrath. "Elder, indeed!" "As I was venturing to explain, these fits of fainting come often in our way. Thieves, mum, that is, the regulars, don't mind us a bit, and the women is more hardeneder than the men. But when we has to speak to a lady, it is so often that she goes off like that. I've known 'em do it just at being looked at." "Don't you think, sir, that you'd better leave us now?" said Mrs. Carbuncle. "Indeed you had," said Lizzie. "I'm fit for nothing just at present." "We won't disturb your ladyship the least in life," said Mr. Bunfit, "if you'll only just let us have your keys. Your servant can be with us, and we won't move one tittle of anything." But Lizzie, though she was still suffering that ineffable sickness which always accompanies and follows a real fainting fit, would not surrender her keys. Already had an excuse for not doing so occurred to her, but for a while she seemed to hesitate. "I don't demand it, Lady Eustace," said Mr. Bunfit, "but if you'll allow me to say so, I do think it will look better for your ladyship." "I can take no step without consulting my cousin, Mr. Greystock," said Lizzie; and having thought of this, she adhered to it. The detective supplied her with many reasons for giving up her keys, alleging that it would do no harm, and that her refusal would create infinite suspicions. But Lizzie had formed her answer, and stuck to it. She always consulted her cousin, and always acted upon his advice. He had already cautioned her not to take any steps without his sanction. She would do nothing till he consented. If Mr. Bunfit would see Mr. Greystock, and if Mr. Greystock would come to her and tell her to submit, she would submit. Ill as she was, she could be obstinate, and Bunfit left the house without having been able to finger that key which he felt sure that Lady Eustace carried somewhere on her person. As he walked back to his own quarters in Scotland Yard, Bunfit was by no means dissatisfied with his morning's work. He had not expected to find anything with Lady Eustace, and, when she fainted, had not hoped to be allowed to search. But he was now sure that her ladyship was possessed, at any rate, of some guilty knowledge. Bunfit was one of those who, almost from the first, had believed that the box was empty when taken out of the hotel. "Stones like them must turn up more or less," was Bunfit's great argument. That the police should already have found the stones themselves was not perhaps probable, but had any ordinary thieves had them in their hands, they could not have been passed on without leaving a trace behind them. It was his opinion that the box had been opened and the door cut by the instrumentality and concurrence of Lord George de Bruce Carruthers, with the assistance of some well-skilled mechanical thief. Nothing could be made out of the tall footman. Indeed, the tall footman had already been set at liberty, although he was known to have evil associates, and the tall footman was now loud in demanding compensation for the injury done to him. Many believed that the tall footman had been concerned in the matter. Many, that is, among the experienced craftsmen of the police force. Bunfit thought otherwise. Bunfit believed that the diamonds were now either in the possession of Lord George or of Harter and Benjamin, that they had been handed over to Lord George to save them from Messrs. Camperdown and the lawsuit, and that Lord George and the lady were lovers. The lady's conduct at their last interview, her fit of fainting, and her clutching for the key, all confirmed Bunfit in his opinion. But unfortunately for Bunfit, he was almost alone in his opinion. There were men in the force, high in their profession as detectives, who avowed that certainly two very experienced and well-known thieves had been concerned in the business, that a certain Mr. Smiler had been there, a gentleman for whom the whole police of London entertained a feeling which approached to veneration, and that most diminutive of full-grown thieves, Billy Cann, most diminutive, but at the same time most expert, was not doubted by some minds which were apt to doubt, till conviction had become certainty. The traveller who had left the Scotch train at Dumfries had been a very small man, and it was a known fact that Mr. Smiler had left London by train, from the Euston Square station, on the day before that on which Lizzie and her party had reached Carlisle. If it were so, if Mr. Smiler and Billy Cann had both been at work at the hotel, then, so argued they who opposed the Bunfit theory,